Our guest now, Helena Ivanov, an associate research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society think tank. She joins us from Belgrade. Hello to you, Helena. I don't know if you were able to hear our correspondent, but basically saying that President Alexander Vucic doesn't look like he's going to back down. These protesters, they're not just commemorating the victims, but they're angry. So I want to ask you, where's this all headed?
Well, that is a very unclear question. I think, ever since the protest began, there has been a constant question of who is going to give in. And I think that a lot of people, at least at the beginning, were not necessarily super optimistic about a student movement's ability to mobilize the masses. But it's been a year. We have seen, as your correspondent said, 300,000 people gathered in March in Belgrade. We've seen 140,000 people gathered again in June. Throughout the year, we've seen people stand in 16-minute vigil on a daily basis anywhere they are. We've seen multiple different protests across the entire country. And today, 365 days after the canopy collapse, we are now seeing tens, if not hundreds of thousands, we'll know the exact estimates as the day comes to a close, gathered again in Novi Sad. So the student movement definitely still has the momentum. The people are angry. The people want justice. The people want accountability. The government, according to some polling, is unlikely to perform as well as they would want in the elections, which is presumably why President Vucic is refusing to call for one. But I think we're very close to a point where he will have to call for elections. The country is not functioning properly. And I think people have had enough of this. I think people want out of this situation. And I think it's been pretty clear for some months now that the only way out is elections.
And the idea that this movement has managed to grow to the size it has is quite remarkable in Serbia, given that the government controls all mainstream media. How did the students manage to get this rally to take place as frequently as it has and to bring in all people from society?
I think one part of it obviously is contextual. Serbia is a country where protests are, quite common. We've had multiple rounds of massive protests during the 13-year rule of Aleksandar Vucic. We've had ones after the two mass shootings that have taken place in 2023. A few years before those, we've had 1 in 5 million protests. So protests are something which is quite common in the Serbian political life. But what I think is very different about these protests is that the students have captured the hearts and the minds of the citizens. They're not seen as ineffective or as corrupt as some members of the opposition are. They have also taken a personal sacrifice to bring about change in this country. The universities have been physically blocked for more than 8 months, which basically means that the students have lost an entire academic year. Moreover, they have walked throughout the country. It's hundreds and hundreds of kilometers that these young people have walked in the attempt to bring about a change. They have cycled to Strasbourg. They have ran an ultramarathon to Brussels. So they've taken a personal, sacrifice to really bring about change. And I think that's something that has really captured the nation and especially older generations, which feel that if the young people are willing to put so much on the line to change this country, then how can they stay at home and not support them?
Yeah, and when we see broad protest movements like this, sometimes the problem is maybe that the idea of change is vague. What are the specific demands that demonstrators have to have won over the hearts and the minds of the people?
Well, I think that's another thing which was very good for the student movement. I think in a lot of previous rounds of protests that Serbia had, as you correctly point out, the demands were really vague and basically came down to let's replace the regime of Aleksandar Vucic. I think the students have made a strategic break from that. And when the protests began, when they've entered the physical blockades of the university, they've centered the whole movement around 4 key demands, the most important one of which was that the entire documentation pertaining to the reconstruction of the train station be made public, because there were serious allegations that the reason why the canopy collapsed at the end comes down to corruption, which is exactly why the students said, look, we want all the papers out there. We want you to be transparent about this because we want to get to the bottom of this. And I think centering the movement around those 4 key demands really helped people understand what the ultimate aim is, which further gave them the motivation to continue protesting until those demands are fulfilled. However, by May of 2025, it has become more than clear that this government has no real intention to really fulfill those demands, which is why the students have changed tune. And now their only demand is snap elections. They're basically saying that this government has no legitimacy. There are serious accusations of excessive use of force by the police during the protests. Accusations were even made that a long-range acoustic device was used during the 15th march of protest in Belgrade. The students have repeatedly been called terrorists and Nazis, and they're basically saying this government has no legitimacy. We need elections, and we need them now. And that's the only demand that they currently have.
And do you think there's any chance the president could walk back and maybe address those four key demands to stop short of calling early elections?
I very much doubt that. I know that your correspondent has mentioned that there was an apology coming from the president yesterday, but I think that there are very few reasons to believe that that apology is any shape or form sincere. The trains have been stopped across the country to disable people from coming to Novi Sad. There are reports that both water and electricity have been shut down in Novi Sad. There are reports that yesterday, as the students were arriving to Novi Sad, paid thugs likely associated with the Serbian Progressive Party were trying to attack the students. The citizens have successfully, ended their attempts to attack the students. But it is very clear that the words said by the president do not match the actions of his government or of anyone who supports the Serbian Progressive Party. In addition to that, this situation has been escalating for months now, and he has continuously refused to fulfill the demands, or alternatively, he claimed that the demands were fulfilled, only to then backtrack on those. And at this point, I just do not foresee that even the students themselves would agree to the four demands being fulfilled. I think the country is so polarized and the tensions are so high that elections now really are the only option.
The only option unless there's escalation. And some people are worried about the students themselves, the universities, the academics. Some fear there could be a purge if this continues.
Well, the students have made it pretty clear, and this stands correct for today as well. They do not want any of their protests to be violent. They have specifically invited citizens to think of today's protest more as a commemoration and paying tribute to the victims rather than any form of protest. So I think if any escalation does indeed occur, it is unlikely to come from the student movement. And if we look back over the last 365 days and all the protests that have been led by the students or organized by the students, violence was in none of those instances was violence instigated by the students. The one thing that we did see the students call for was civil disobedience. But even then, they have been pretty clear that any form of civil disobedience must always be nonviolent. So should any escalation occur, I do not have any reasons to believe at this point that it would be caused or motivated or called upon by the student movement.
Serbia is a candidate for EU membership. How closely do you think Brussels is watching what's going on?
I think Brussels is watching really, really closely. We've seen Marta Kos, who is the commissioner for the expansion of the European Union, come to Serbia. She has also met with the students. I think really the institution that's been most vocal about what is going on is the European Parliament. We have a few MEPs, notably Helena Ivanov, who have multiple times said that what the regime of Aleksandar Vucic is doing is illegitimate, who have openly, supported the student movement. We've seen the European Parliament also publish a harshest resolution on Serbia to date. But the problem is that excluding the European Parliament, the high officials of the EU, the president of the European Commission, most of what we've gotten really from them are empty statements. There hasn't really been any change of their approach towards Serbia. And yes, of course, they will always say that they're closely monitoring the country. And yes, of course, they will always say that all resolution must be peaceful. They will always invite the both sides to the dialogue, but they are not really in any shape or form choosing a side. And they continue to collaborate with Mr. Vucic's regime, despite some pretty obvious democratic backsliding that is taking place. At the same time, it should also be noted that this government has received pretty explicit support from the Kremlin. The government of Serbia has been pushing for this narrative that these protests are a color revolution funded by the West. Obviously, there has been no evidence offered to actually support that claim, but we have heard the officials from Kremlin support this notion propagated by the Serbian government. And I really think, at this point, the EU has a chance to change the way the citizens see the European Union. I think, the support to join the EU has been on a steady decline for the last 2 years. A lot of people believe that Serbia will never join the bloc because the accession process has taken so long. And I think at this point, a lot of people who are protesting are very dissatisfied with the way in which the EU has approached this, again, with the exception of the European Parliament, because they want the EU to be more vocal and more supportive of the movement. And I think the EU now has a chance to show that it really does prioritize democracy and the rule of law in Serbia, rather than some strategic interests.
Helena, thank you very much for your time. Helena Ivanov joining us from Belgrade. Thank you.